Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal and this is video 2 for performance appraisal. We're going to start off with rating errors and biases this time. And the first we'll talk about is leniency error. And this is when a supervisor or the person giving the rating gives all employees a high rating. So you might have heard the term leniency in the context of classes. So some teachers are more lenient than others. If you have a very lenient professor, all students in the class will attain very high grades regardless of how much they actually learned throughout the course of the semester. On the other hand, you can also have a bias towards strictness or severity, and this refers to giving all employees very low ratings. The analog to college professors would be the professor where every student attains a D or an F or even a C in the class, regardless of how much they've learned throughout the semester. That would be an indication of strictness or severity. Another rating error is central tendency error, and this is an error where a rater gives all employees mid-range ratings. So rather than differentiating between employees in terms of identifying who are the good performers, who are the poor performers, everyone receives a middle-of-the-road rating. All three of these, leniency, strictness, and central tendency, are referred to as range restriction errors. And the reason for that is because they limit or restrict the range of the ratings that are given to the employee. So in the case of leniency, everyone gets high ratings. In the case of strictness, everyone gets low ratings. In the case of central tendency, people get mostly mid-range scores. So you can probably think of some reasons why this might happen, right? So what can you think of in terms of why some of these errors might happen in organizations? Take a second and pause the video if you'd like. So one reason why this can happen is managers might not have the information that they need in order to rate the employee. So if that's the case, then they might be more likely to just go central tendency and give everyone middle of the road ratings because they don't really know how their employees are doing. Maybe they're not observing their employees' behavior or they're otherwise just out of the loop. What can you think of as a reason to be super lenient, do you think? Well, some managers just want everyone to like them, right? And so they might just give everyone a high rating in the hopes that everyone will like them, or maybe they're afraid to give low ratings because they're afraid of like backlash because of low ratings. So in that case, you could have some leniency. So these are all reasons why these errors can occur, and certainly there are other ones as well. But these, again, are referred to as range restriction. Another type of error is called a contrast error, and this occurs when an employee's performance is rated higher or lower than it actually is due to its contrast with other employees within the work group. So let's take a look at the figure here, and which employee designated by the red circle would be rated higher? Which one do you think? So you have on the left-hand side, you've got a circle and you've got like some relatively large circles around the red circle in the middle. On the right-hand side, you have actually the same size circle. So believe it or not, these two red circles are the same size. But you have smaller circles surrounding the red circle on the right. So if we think of these in the circles as being the performance of people and bigger being better, you might imagine that the person on the right, the red circle on the right, would be rated higher, right? Because they're doing better than the people around them, as opposed to the person on the left who seems to be doing worse than the people around them. In reality, they're both the same. They're both the same size. They both represent the same ratings. So hopefully that visual depiction helps depict what I mean about the contrast error. So it has to do with the people around you and what their performance is, I should say. Another type of error is the halo effect, and this is referring to when a rater's overall impression of an employee affects the entire assessment of that employee, regardless of the questions being asked or regardless of the actual performance. So an example of this could be if I have an employee working for me who's really good at writing reports. And I'm so impressed with how well this person writes their reports that bleeds over into every aspect of my rating for them. So I'm also going to rate them highly on customer service performance and other things, which may not actually be true. It might just be that my feelings about them from knowing one part of their performance have affected how I rate them in other parts of their performance. The next is similarity in liking bias. And the idea behind this is that employees who are viewed as more similar to the manager may develop a higher quality relationship with that manager. And in turn, that manager may rate the employee's performance higher than is warranted. So in other words, if you like your employee, you're probably more likely to rate them as higher, and that would be called the similarity or the liking bias. The last one on this slide 19 is recency error, and this is referring to positive and negative events that occur just before an assessment having an influence on the rating. So say you've been performing really well all year and then something bad happens that affects your performance right before your performance appraisal. Your manager might potentially be focused on that negative event that just occurred and to the detriment or ignoring the positive evidence that happened all year. So this would be referred to as the recency error. So what this meme here is saying is that when you develop a performance review system with clear criteria but managers adjust based on their personal judgment, it's kind of getting at this idea of biases or errors that come into play during performance appraisal. And really, as IO psychologists, we can really do as much as we possibly can to try to eliminate some of these, but ultimately it is up to the supervisors themselves. And so now let's talk about some ways that we can help minimize these errors or biases. So this is really important, and your book does get into more detail on these. But the first is training. So training supervisors to give effective performance ratings, training them on things like what these different biases are. Making people aware of the biases that exist is one step toward helping decrease the bias that can come into play. Calibration meetings is another thing that can be done. And what I mean by calibration meetings is having meetings across different supervisors to sort of get on the same page with what a certain rating means. So having a very clear understanding of what it means to exceeds expectations on a performance review or meets expectations or below expectations. So talking about what those different rating points on a scale might mean and going through some examples to help get people on the same page with how they're rating their employees. Diary keeping is another method, and this refers to the manager keeping a record of various things that come up during the year or during the time frame for their performance appraisal. And by doing this, they're helping decrease the chance for retrospective bias, that bias that comes into play, recency error, which comes into play when something positive or negative happens right before the performance appraisal. So having a good idea of what happened all year can help avoid that. Using some objective appraisals can help. So not just relying only on subjective ratings, but also bringing in any possible objective things like dollars, amount earned, things like that. Using multiple raters is another one. So in order to decrease the amount of bias or the degree to which bias affects someone in terms of their performance ratings, you can have multiple people conducting the ratings. And finally, increasing accountability. And this is referring to holding managers accountable for being accurate in their performance appraisals. And putting an emphasis on the fact that it's necessary to be accurate and holding people accountable when you see something like evidence of leniency bias or evidence of central tendency bias. Really forcing managers to take a look at how they are rating people and to put lots of thought into that. Now let's talk about some different types of performance appraisals. So we're moving on from errors to talk about types. There are two broad categories that we can talk about here. The first is absolute appraisals, where you compare performance of an employee to pre-established criteria. And the other is relative appraisals, where you compare the performance of an employee to other employees' performance. And so which of these do you think that you would prefer if you were being rated? Would you want your performance to be compared to some criteria that's already been established, or would you want to be held in competition or in comparison with other employees? Well, a lot of people would say that they would prefer absolute appraisals. They would prefer to know what the criteria are that they're being held to, and then they can work toward meeting those criteria, and their performance will be determined based on that. But there are relative appraisals that exist, and so we're going to talk about some specific types of each of these next. The first type of absolute appraisal is a graphic rating scale. And a graphic rating scale is very common. You've probably seen these before, and there are some examples on this slide. There are actually 3 different examples. So the first one here at the top demonstrates knowledge of assigned work, A, B, C, above expectations, meet expectations, below expectations. So this is an example at the top here of a graphic rating scale. Here's another example. So overall performance of the employee, and the manager would select the one that corresponds with what they rate their employee as. Expresses ideas clearly. Here's another one. So these are all examples of what we call graphic rating scales. Now, the other type of absolute performance appraisal system is called a behaviorally anchored rating scale, or a BARS. And in a behaviorally anchored rating scale, each point on the scale is illustrated or depicted or detailed by very specific forms of behavior. So in other words, when developing these, people who are creating these BARS scales, the subject matter experts who are creating them, they come up with specific behaviors that correspond with a score on the scale. So in this example here, we have scores ranging from 1 on the low end to 8 on the high end. And you can see that there are various behaviors that are associated with each of those score points. So if the manager is assigning a 1 or a 2, they are looking at these behaviors, and these are what their employees are behaving as. So often misses deadlines, needs constant reminders and follow-up on assigned tasks, not aware of team's current performance, team is not meeting performance targets. That would be the lowest rating of a 1 or a 2. Now, a rating of a 3 or a 4 includes these: is reliable, remains focused on the delivery of delegated tasks, follows through on personal commitments and undertakings, strives to complete work on or before deadlines, and renegotiates dates in advance when required. That would be a 3 or a 4. A 5 or a 6 is reliable and keeps the team focused on outcome delivery, maintains focus on the most important goals, and closes discussion with action plans. And then finally, the highest rating, here are the behaviors: sets challenging, stretch goals that align with business unit's goals, takes personal responsibility for achieving results, and consistently follows through to achieve agreed outcomes. So these are examples of what would be behavioral anchors, these behavioral anchors that go along with the scale points for monitoring progress. That would be the competency in this case that's being rated here. Okay, so now that we've talked about some absolute scales, let's talk about some relative scales. The first is straight ranking, and this is when a rater ranks employees from strongest to weakest in terms of their performance, like you have here in the graphic, 1, 2, 3, and so on. One advantage of the straight ranking is that it can be used for decision-making purposes because it forces raters to differentiate between and identify top performers. So if you have to decide, hey, there's one person in this organization that's going to get this promotion, a straight ranking will be helpful because it forces you to really think through that. It also addresses some forms of bias, right? So it's hard, you can't really do central tendency, you can't do leniency, you can't do some of those when you have this type of ranking because you have to differentiate between people. One downside is that it becomes increasingly more difficult as the number of employees to be rated increases. So what is really the difference between like a 5 and a 6 once you have like 10 people? Is that meaningful? And along those lines, this type of ranking assumes that the performance difference between those ranked 1 and 2 is equal to the difference between employees ranked 5 and 6, for example, which is often not the case because people are messy. We are not able to be put into very distinct categories, and certainly the difference between people might be larger or smaller depending on the rank. The next type of relative is a forced distribution. And this is when the rater places employees into different categories, such as excellent, average, needs improvement, and so on, but only a specific percentage of employees can be placed in each category. So you have different categories, and you have to place a certain percentage of the employees in each category. So it forces a distribution. That's why it's called forced distribution. One advantage of this is that it makes raters differentiate among employees, which again, just similar to the last one that we talked about, can help with decision making. Similarly, it can help with some forms of bias. Again, you can't have leniency or strictness or central tendency if you're being forced to put people into these distribution categories. One downside is that it can de-emphasize or incentivize teamwork and differentiate between performance when there is not a meaningful difference, kind of similar to the other relative method that we just talked about. Slide 27 has an example of a forced distribution. So you can see here that these numbers on the y-axis ranging from 0 to 10, these are frequencies, so the number of employees that fit in each category. And you have excellent, good, acceptable, poor, and very poor. So how many people can go into the excellent category? Well, we can see that there's 3 here. So only 3 people can go into excellent. Now, how many people can go into good? 6. Okay, how many people can go into acceptable? 9. And so forth and so on. Okay, so if a manager has, this many employees, they have to divvy them up and put them in the category that corresponds with their performance, but in the shape of this distribution. Here is another comic with some humor about forced distribution. The company requires me to give failing performance reviews to 20% of my staff. There are 4 of you, so that works out to 80% of a person. While your calf muscles and ankles are performing well, but the rest of you is monkey hurlage. So this is kind of just getting at some of the cynicism and maybe ridiculousness of trying to use this type of method in a very serious way. Okay, so let's talk about now who should rate. You have different sources of ratings, right? So you've got managers can do ratings, you've got peers or coworkers, you've got customers that can provide ratings, subordinates, and you can have self-ratings. There are pros and cons of each, and your textbook gets into this more. But this meme here is illustrating one of the points that I wanted to make about it, which is that self-ratings of performance don't often match supervisor ratings. So sometimes self-ratings of performance tend to be higher than a supervisor would rate an individual. So we need to consider that and keep that in mind. Now you can have manager ratings, like I said, peer or coworker ratings. Some of the advantages of having peer or coworker ratings is that you get a diversity of view. So rather than just having the manager ratings, if you also introduce coworker ratings, that can be helpful because it's an external source of information. It decreases the chance of bias from the manager having a real strong influence on the outcome of the performance appraisal. However, you could probably imagine that there can be problems with that. So if people are friends, they might rate each other higher. If they don't like each other, they might rate each other lower, and that might not have anything to do with actual performance, but more in terms of that similarity or liking bias. Similar with customers, so that can be another helpful piece of information, but you do need to consider some of the biases that can come into play with customer ratings. So customers may be more likely to rate when they're very happy or very dissatisfied, for example. 360-degree feedback is when an individual receives ratings from multiple sources. So like the graphic here says, they get rated by their peers or coworkers, their superior, their manager or managers if they have more than one. They get their direct reports also provide ratings, so subordinates in case they're in a managerial position, and then others such as customers also provide ratings, and the self provides ratings as well. So you have all these different sources of information and ratings, and the 360-degree feedback is based on the assumption that awareness of discrepancies can enhance someone's self-awareness. So for example, if I am more likely to rate myself very high in a certain category, but then I happen to see that my manager and my coworkers are rating me a little bit lower in that category. That's like kind of good information for me to have, because if I only receive that information from one source, like just my supervisor, I might be willing to like blow it off like, oh, well, they don't really know my performance, or they are biased against me in some way. But when I'm hearing it from multiple different sources, that can really serve as a catalyst for change. Also, enhanced self-awareness can be helpful for maximizing performance because it becomes the basis of developmental activities like job coaching. So helping a person grow and develop and kind of minimize those weaknesses and maximize performance is helpful. So this 360-degree feedback is helpful for that. Goals for developmental versus administrative purposes must be set. If you remember, in the last video, we talked about these two. Developmental is all about growth. Administrative is all about giving out outcomes, like who gets performance ratings that correspond with a raise, or who might get demoted or laid off. So 360-degree feedback is recommended for developmental purposes only. So it's not recommended for administrative purposes when you have these high stakes outcomes, like maybe getting fired or getting a lower amount of a salary increase or something like that. Here's another comic with some information about 360-degree feedback. So I'll let you go ahead and read that, and you can pause the video if you need to. Now, in terms of conducting the actual performance appraisal, the manager's responsibilities include observing and recording feedback about the employee's performance over the course of a year, so keeping that diary if they need to, providing feedback and coaching throughout the year, using a designated form to rate the employee. So like I said, typically those are done online nowadays, and communicating the performance ratings and feedback to the employee during a meeting. Like I've said, observation should be the basis for ratings that are given to the employee. And the rater should adequately sample behavior over time, meaning that the rater or the supervisor, if they're doing the ratings, shouldn't just focus on one point in time, like the week leading up to the performance appraisal, for example. One thing that can facilitate observing and recording performance over time is electronic performance monitoring. However, this can become sort of controversial, and we went over this a little bit in your week 2, your research methods, about some of this electronic performance monitoring and some of the downsides potentially to that. In terms of feedback and coaching, as the rater is observing performance, feedback should be provided in a timely fashion along with coaching. So feedback should not wait until the end of the year. It should not wait until the performance appraisal. It should be given when it's relevant. Coaching is referring to developing a person to achieve their professional goals. In regular one-on-one meetings of the employee with the supervisor can provide opportunities for them to talk about performance and set goals. This last slide goes over tips for conducting the performance appraisal meeting. So before the meeting, the supervisor should help to ensure a positive feedback context in which them and the employee have an ongoing relationship. So setting the tone throughout the year by working to maintain a good relationship with an employee. The supervisor should prepare for the meeting by gathering anything that's needed and scheduling a private meeting space. So this is a private conversation. This is not for other people to listen to. During the meeting, the supervisor should allow the employee to contribute to the discussion and limit the number of topics to be discussed. So don't try to do everything in a short amount of time. Give enough time to go over things. Use the sandwich technique for delivering feedback. So you may have heard of this sandwich technique. What I mean by that is you create a feedback sandwich by having the slices of bread be positive things. So talking about something positive that the employee did, and then the inside of the sandwich, like the meat or the vegetables in the sandwich, depending on what you prefer, is the negative feedback or the constructive criticism. And then the bottom layer of the bread is, again, some positive feedback. So by doing that, it kind of cushions the blow of any constructive feedback and provides the employee with an opportunity to be able to listen to what they have to say. And finally, develop an action plan that describes goals for the future and what the employee and the supervisor will do to help improve on the ratie's effectiveness or to meet those goals that they have set for themselves for the ratee.